An important development in the internal control landscape was recently completed with an update to the so-called integrated framework of the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations of the Treadway Commission. Viewers will recall that since 1992, COSO's original internal control framework was accepted by the SEC as a framework for attesting to internal control over financial reporting and has been recognized as the leading guidance for designing, implementing, and conducting internal control and assessing its effectiveness. In fact, the SEC's chief accountant has already reiterated that companies would be wise to pay attention to what COSO says about its old framework, that the original 1992 framework will, in fact, be obsolete at the end of 2014. The good news is that the same 5 main components of the original framework, control environment, risk assessment, control activities, information and communication, and monitoring activities, remain the foundation for the updated framework. But globalization and technology have accelerated at dizzying rates in the past 2 decades. And in a world that is marked by smartphones and cloud computing, it seemed prudent for COSO to update an original framework that was published before cell phones and email became common. The most significant development in COSO's new framework is the articulation of 17 specific principles spread across the 5 main components of internal control. Each principle is accompanied by explicit points of focus designed to help users evaluate whether the principle is present and functioning.
Returning to our program is John McLaughlin, a partner as well as the Risk Advisory Services Leader for BDO USA LLP. Thanks for joining us once again, John.
It's great to see you, Becky. Thank you.
Well, earlier this year, as you told me they would, John, the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations of the Treadway Commission did replace the original 1992 Internal Control Framework with an updated version. But please remind me, if that original framework was so successful and stood the test of time, why was it updated? Was there an outcry for revision?
Becky, I'm not sure I would say that there was an outcry, but if you look at what was created in '92, which was the original framework, that was created on the heels of the banking crisis of the late '80s or so. Charles Keating is a name that your viewers may remember. It was created in a different world. So if you look at the way the world is now, compared to back then, with globalization, outsourcing, companies operating with multiple currencies, obviously in multiple countries. So you've got cultures and mores. You've got more regulation and compliance that's required. Certainly technology has changed dramatically. So business has transformed, Becky, and COSO itself has seen the need for transformation. You know, companies are going through a re-examination of the way they conduct business to make it more efficient, to recognize the changes in the business environment, again, with the things that I had mentioned earlier. And we too, as an organization, as BDO, we are helping our clients go through this transformation exercise. So here too, COSO needed to go through a transformation exercise itself, just like many organizations are going through that today.
Well, so many changes in so little time. So let me go back to basics. They're not going to change the COSO cube, are they?
But you also mentioned, Becky, the cube, and the cube will remain relatively unchanged in that you still have the 5 components of internal control. 1 being the control environment, 2 being risk assessment, 3 being control activities, information and communication being the 4th, and monitoring activities being the 5th. What has changed, though, and there are a number of changes, but 2 significant ones are that the objective relating to reporting, and you'll recall there are 3 objectives in that cube: operations, reporting, and compliance with laws and regulations. And essentially, the reporting objective has expanded, and it's expanded beyond what in '92 they called financial reporting, and now it's reporting.
Well, I suppose that giving the original COSO guidance an update or a makeover might be a good idea. It was difficult enough to remember the 3 core objectives and the 5 framework components. Are we really going to have to learn 17 new principles, John?
Well, bluntly, Becky, the answer is yes, and then some. I can't remember the 17 principles, or at least not yet. I can't even remember the names of my kids sometimes. I've got 4 children, and I get them mixed up. But the 17 principles are fundamental to this in that COSO is articulating that for internal control to be effective, that the principles need to be present and functioning, and that the components in the principles need to be operating in an integrated manner. Those 2 concepts are key to this. So the users will see 17 principles, and the 17 principles laid across the 5 components. So if memory serves me right, 5 principles relate to the control environment, 4 relate to risk assessment, 3 relate to control activities, another 3 relate to information and communication, and there are 2 that relate to monitoring activities.
Well, it's not just new principles, is it, John? Isn't there also something called points of focus? And are there really 75 of them?
Becky, there are 75 points of focus, and the points of focus are very important in that they describe a characteristic of a principle. And the COSO is expressing that essentially these points of focus need to demonstrate how these principles are in place. COSO, though, is indicating that not every point of focus necessarily needs to be in place, so that a separate evaluation be made of the 75 points of focus. They recognize, for instance, that a particular industry or something that's unique to your company may not give rise to the points of focus that are within the framework. But the bottom line is that points of focus are very important in helping companies establish the presence and functioning of principles. And the reality, too, is that if you've got one point of focus demonstrating one principle, it's probably not a good place to be in terms of demonstrating compliance with Sarbanes-Oxley, is that there's safety in numbers.
Well, on one hand, the framework is more granular, but on the other hand, there's still an opportunity for subjective judgment, isn't there?
That's a great question, Becky, because judgment, I think, is expressed throughout this framework. Is that COSO has given a good deal of granularity to the updated framework compared to where we were in 1992. And that should be very helpful. It should be very helpful, actually, in utilizing judgment. And COSO talks about the use of judgment. If you can visualize the cube again, we've got objectives and components, and the application of components against those objectives requires judgment. The application of principles as it relates to components requires judgment. And there are approaches and examples as well. But the use of risk assessment or the application of risk assessment requires judgment. So when designing and implementing controls and selecting control activities, that requires judgment. And ultimately, the assessment of whether deficiencies exist within the controls framework, that requires judgment. So COSO is expressing that judgment is used throughout this framework. And my belief is that with this added granularity, is that it should actually help management apply even better judgment to their control environment.
Besides revising the framework itself, COSO also issued 2 new companion tools. Let me ask you first, John, about the so-called compendium. I've heard it referred to as the ICFR compendium. What exactly does that mean? So,
well, ICFR is another acronym. It's internal controls over external financial reporting. What COSO recognized is that the framework has to address reporting of all kinds, as we talked about in the cube. Is that so internal reporting, external reporting. The compendium, though, is really designed to help, call it accountants, but companies establish a system of internal control for the attestation of, say, Section 404 of Sarbanes-Oxley.
Again, it's not going to alter or modify the framework itself, is it?
The framework will continue to be the framework, is that the compendium mirrors the framework. So we talked about 17 principles, and what the users of the framework and the compendium will recognize is that the 17 principles are very similar in the compendium as they are in the framework. Incidentally, the points of focus as well are also similar to those that are in the compendium versus the framework too. Just one other thing about the compendium is the compendium also provides approaches and examples, and if memory serves me right, there's something like 90 approaches and about 130 or so examples in there. And I think the purpose of those is really to help the readers or the users of the compendium truly understand the application of things that are conceptual, like points of focus. So the approaches describe the overall concept. The examples actually provide illustrative examples of how these points of focus are put in place. So the users of the compendium will see something different there and something very helpful in them achieving their assessment of the effectiveness of internal control.
Well, that makes sense, John. So let me ask you about the second piece of companion guidance, illustrative tools for assessing the effectiveness of an internal control system. Up until now, we really haven't had much focus from COSO on the effectiveness of controls, have we?
That's a great question because, as you recall, several years ago, Becky, you and I were talking about the guidance for smaller public companies in 2006. And there they had tools that helped a company to demonstrate their internal control process. I think here, to your question, is the updated framework really helps companies assess the effectiveness of their internal control environment. So the tools that exist within the framework, or as an appendix to the framework, help a company to demonstrate not only the components, but the principles, and then lay out basically what is the evidence for each of these points of focus that lie beneath each of these principles. The other thing that's provided in this framework, or in the appendix to the framework, are scenarios. So COSO goes through a number of scenarios. Actually, there's 5 scenarios where basically they're trying to help an organization determine whether a principle is present and functioning, and whether the components are operating in an integrated way with the principles, and how deficiencies are evaluated, how they're evaluated across several organizations within an entity. So there are 5 scenarios in there that really help the users to pull this together and to assess the effectiveness of their control environment.
Well, since you're an auditor, John, let me ask you, if an enterprise has a major deficiency, does that mean that you can't conclude on the effectiveness of controls overall?
This is a big question, Becky. Actually, it's a question that will get bigger because I'm getting this question from clients even now. So why? Why am I getting this question? It's because COSO basically describes what constitutes a deficiency. Let me read the definition of internal control deficiency. It's a shortcoming in a relevant principle or an associated component that has the potential to adversely affect the ability of the entity to achieve its objectives. And a major deficiency is where a deficiency or a combination of deficiencies serve enough to adversely affect the likelihood that the entity can achieve its objectives. So to state it even more simply is, if a principle is not present and functioning, you have a deficiency. But COSO emphasizes the importance of judgment. So for instance, they cite, the cost versus benefit of controls. The fact that management has to go through a risk assessment and determine the relative importance of certain controls over others. So they provide the definitions of deficiencies and major deficiency, but they're also saying utilize judgment in making this evaluation.
Well, naturally, many of our viewers still think of COSO framework in connection with management's assertion relating to internal control over financial reporting. To what extent, John, does the COSO framework only involve internal financial reporting?
While the compendium evaluates or helps companies evaluate the effectiveness of their control over external financial reporting, COSO, though, is designed to address all kinds of reporting. So the concept of internal reporting is within the framework itself and the importance of internal reporting. So, for instance, if you look back at the governance failures that have occurred over the past decade or so, and probably beyond that, is that where did the issue arise? Is the issue probably arose in the internal reporting first and then culminated into an external reporting issue. So COSO is trying to enhance the understanding of internal reporting and its importance to the internal control framework. Internal reporting applies to really the 3 objectives within COSO, and that being the operations itself. There's lots of reporting that relates to the operations. As we talked about reporting itself internally and externally, small companies, large companies, public, private, they all have reporting requirements to regulators, to constituents. And then reporting on laws and regulations.
Well, it's been more than a decade since Congress enacted the Sarbanes-Oxley legislation with its Section 404 top-down risk assessment. I'm curious, why does the updated 2013 framework seem to have so much more of an emphasis on fraud?
So if you look at the original framework, arose from the banking crisis and the irregularities that occurred in certain sections of the banking sector back then. And then you fast forward to the early 2000s or so and the governance failures that occurred at that time. And you look at today's environment, is that COSO is saying that there needs to be a distinct evaluation of frauds. So Principle 8 emphasizes risk assessment, and there are four points of focus related to Principle 8, and those being that a consideration of various types of fraud being one, an assessment of incentives and pressures to individuals. A third point of focus is assessing various opportunities to commit fraud. And a fourth is assessing attitudes and rationalizations. So as I mentioned earlier about points of focus mattering, is that these, as you can hear, these points of focus take a different view on this particular principle. And I would say, if you're helping to try and demonstrate, or you're trying to demonstrate the presence and functioning of the risk assessment principle, is that those 4 points of focus really need to be demonstrated. You can't do it with just one point of focus.
Well, speaking of the early 2000s, I recall that when you first told me about COSO's so-called ERM framework, does this updated framework replace the need for a separate framework on enterprise risk management?
Well, my understanding, Becky, is that COSO considered combining the ERM framework with the internal control framework, and ultimately they decided to keep them separate. So my understanding now is that these will remain as separate frameworks for quite some time. There's not, in the foreseeable future, COSO is not talking about reevaluating or revising the ERM framework. But what they did do to help users, because these concepts are interrelated between ERM and internal controls, is that in Appendix G, they describe the differences between the two frameworks, and they help users to recognize those differences. So they describe those concepts that are similar to both the internal control and ERM framework, those concepts that are touched upon in the internal control framework but are expanded in the ERM framework, and then those components that are incremental to the ERM framework.
What about those risk management issues that you've described for me in the past, John, such as risk appetite? To what extent are they included in the updated framework?
Well, another great question, because with the concept of ERM, things like risk appetite and risk tolerance almost go hand in hand. But interestingly, is that the risk appetite is really not described in the internal control framework. And just as a point of reference is, what is risk appetite? And risk appetite is basically the broad-based amount of risk an organization is willing to take in pursuit of its mission or its goals. So for instance, a company may say that we want to grow in international markets, and however, they may have a high risk appetite to do so, for that growth, but they may have a low risk appetite as it relates to allegations of bribery with foreign officials. Risk tolerance, on the other hand, is really setting a measure around risk. So maybe as an example or two would be, say, a call center. A call center may say that we can't have an outage of more than 10 minutes or 15 minutes. That's a tolerance. They may say that we can't have customers on hold for more than 30 seconds or 60 seconds. These are tolerances within an organization. So when you're utilizing both frameworks, is you need to look at the ERM framework to establish something like appetite, and utilizing something like the internal control framework to gauge tolerance.
Well, it also seems to me, at least, that there is an explicit focus on IT issues in the updated framework. Is that just a sign of the changing technological times, or does it also relate to COSO's operations and compliance objectives?
Well, I think technology relates to all the components of COSO. So the reporting, the internal, the external reporting. It also relates to operations, and it relates to compliance with laws and regulations. Technology is really ubiquitous to business process at this point. So if you look at the original framework, what was prevalent of the day, of that era, was mainframe computing and client-server computing, the emergence of client-server computing. And if you looked at 10 years ago, 12 years ago or so, the emergence of ERP systems. And now we look at the environment and say there's cloud computing, virtualization, privacy, software as a service, ASPs, mobile computing. So much has changed just even within the past 10 years. So COSO saw the need to dedicate a principle, Principle 11, to technology. And probably what they debated as well was, can we develop a principle and points of focus that will withstand the test of time for, say, the next 20 years, or maybe even the next 10 years? So the points of focus really describe what I'll call as 4 levels. The first level being process and general technology controls. The second level being technology infrastructure controls. The third being security and roles and role-based security and access to data based upon what your influence is in the organization. And then the fourth is around systems development, life cycle, application changes and updates and development, things of that nature.
Thanks, John. We'll return to your commentary in a minute.
As John McLaughlin indicated, the announcement of the updated integrated framework earlier this year was accompanied by a statement from COSO that users should, quote, transition their applications and related documentation to the updated framework as soon as feasible under their particular circumstances, end quote. The good news is that COSO intends to continue to make available its original framework during the transition period, extending to December 15, 2014. The bad news is that after that time, COSO will consider the 1992 framework to be superseded by the 2013 framework.
Okay, the new framework officially supersedes the original 1992 framework just over 1 year from now. What's the official guidance on making the transition?
Well, okay, so Becky, you mentioned the word transition, and I think people are getting confused with the word effective date. Is that COSO has expressed a transition date, and that transition date being December 15, 2014. Their belief is that the framework has been out there now for several months, and that we still have all of 2014 essentially to get accustomed to this, and that represents a sufficient amount of time for transition. So as of that date, COSO was basically saying that it supersedes the old framework, the 1992 framework. But statements have been made as well by the regulatory authorities. I'm familiar with some statements that were made by a representative of the SEC, and taking more of a let's see type of an attitude in his answer. And that being, I think, sensitive to the environment that we're in. We're still in a challenging economic environment, and I think smaller companies, and I'm thinking about more smaller public companies, and the challenges that they have to embrace something like 17 principles and 75 points of focus, is that I think the SEC is trying to be sensitive to that and taking that kind of let's see approach. The reality, though, is that this is the new standard, this is the new framework, and that the company should begin to embrace it.
Well, that makes sense, John. But what are you unofficially advising your clients that they should do, or at least consider, during the transition to the new 2013 framework?
Well, we're getting that question quite a bit. How do we react to this or respond to this is what my clients are asking. There's two things. It's educate and it's diagnose. And from an education standpoint, my view is that you need to educate different constituents within the organization. So how you educate a board and an audit committee on the COSO framework. And by the way, there's about 500 pages cover to cover of what COSO has created here. So it's going to take some time for people to get through it. But recognize that the message that you send to an audit committee or a board is different than maybe having senior management or certainly operations management embrace this. So as part of the education process, my view is that you need to use maybe different points of focus when you're conveying COSO and its importance to an organization within operations, so that they can understand maybe at their level how important principles and their own points of focus are in achieving better control. The second is, or effective control. The second is diagnosing. And COSO, as we were talking about, has templates in the back of, or in the appendices, is evaluating where you stand with these principles. And I'm telling my clients as well is, let's evaluate each of these points of focus. COSO's made it clear you don't have to have every point of focus necessarily to demonstrate effective internal control or the existence of a principle, the presence and functioning of a principle. But I'm saying to them is, let's be honest, let's look in the mirror and determine how strong is the documentation, the evidence that we have to demonstrate the presence of this principle in the form of these points of focus.
From your perspective, John, how do you begin? Is there a first step that companies should take?
That's another great question because, as I mentioned, there's over 500 pages in this, and it will take some time to get accustomed to it. My advice is to begin reading it, and but the answer to that and how you begin to read it may depend upon who you are. So let me just give you a couple examples. If you're, and I'm getting this question from people, actually I get this question more than any other question about this, is how do I begin? If you're say an internal audit director, and I was an internal audit director for a large company, I would say start with the framework, because your role evaluates the operations as well as the reporting, as well as compliance with laws and regulations. You'll have to spend time in that framework and then move on to the other sections of what COSO has provided.
As accountants and financial executives, our viewers are very bottom line oriented. I suppose they want to know, has there been a return for their substantial investment in developing a system of internal control?
Becky, you asked me that question before, and my answer is still the same, is what's the alternative? Not to have a control environment, which they also call as the tone at the top. Not to conduct risk assessment, not to have control activities, not to communicate, not to have information, not to monitor your system of internal control. There really is no alternative. And I'd say that really that good control is good business. And the way you apply this framework should be effective, or should help many companies in demonstrating or having a more effective organization. I also see here, though, an opportunity is that when a company is instituting this new framework and evaluating the principles and the points of focus and the controls that underlie those, is that management should be asking itself, do we have too many controls in a particular area? Are there not enough controls here? Is the control all that effective? So looking at, say, for instance, inventory as an example, is perhaps there are physical inventory counts, which is a control activity that's taking place, but perhaps given its significance to the organization, its balance, its materiality, is that perhaps maybe analytical review on a periodic basis as opposed to physical counts. So analytical review being a monitoring activity may make more sense. Risk assessment as well is recalibrating risk and re-examining the impact of controls as it relates to materiality, as it relates to risk, and taking a fresh look at the way you're evaluating risks in a company. So there's just a couple examples as to how the institution of this new framework may help to provide just better governance.
As always, you've covered a lot of ground for us this month, John. If our viewers could take one thought away from this discussion, what would you like that to be?
If you're a CFO or a controller or an accounting manager or an accounting staff, my suggestion would be that you start with the compendium, because you need to get started in terms of perhaps Sarbanes-404 or some other regulatory requirement around the effectiveness of your internal controls. And by the way, COSO would probably say you need to read the entire thing, and you do. But there has to be a place to start, and I think the compendium for a CFO and his or her staff is important. The other is an audit committee member or an audit committee chair. That's a little bit more of a difficult maybe answer here, but my sense is this, is that you need to start with perhaps the executive summary. And if I'm an audit committee member of a public organization, I would say look at the compendium, read the compendium, because your responsibilities, your fiduciary responsibilities, will ultimately come back to the integrity of the financial reporting. And I think getting a very good grip on the compendium, the principles, the points of focus, is something that's incumbent upon you and your role.
BDO's John McLaughlin, thanks once again for bringing us up to date.
Always a pleasure, Becky.
That interview with John McLaughlin concludes the December 2013 edition of Financial Management Network. On behalf of everyone at FMN, thank you for joining us this month, and our best wishes for jolly holidays. We look forward to bringing you up to date again next year with our January 2014 release.